due to the file in the archives being quite vast, the Ordo Theoreticus has decided to present a short clip of its contents. Also, if the Inquisitor makes me carry these files and books back all by myself again... Hey, next time I'll take a servitor with me. Battle Cry of the Heralds Brothers, with Faith and Fury. Livery. The sigil of the Heralds of Volkaire remains an ambiguous curiosity to both Imperial and Astartes scholars alike. The most prominent theories propose that the symbol is either a sun or a warp rift. Founding and Progenitor. The founding of Heralds of Volkaire is unknown, with inquiring into their gene seed's origins being forbidden by a bull absolute from Vandaia after their emergence in Imperial records in M36, which was upheld by the High Lords after Vandaia's deposition later in the same millennium. Most Imperial scholars have little knowledge of the Heralds, as they are intensely secretive to outsiders. The Heralds' conclave placed the founding as sometime in the 8th founding during M34, with their lineage being of either the Blood Angel or Ultramarine gene seed. With most Magisters and Archons leaning towards Ultramarine stock due to their location in the Ultima Segmentum and the possession of ancient Ultramarine artifacts from the Great Crusade, particularly the Battle of Calth, with the Crozius Arcanum of Numinus being a point of much pride and prestige amongst the Ultramarine descendants. However, many have suggested how such gifts could have been bestowed by chance or as items of gratitude for prior deeds. Furthermore, many point to the ancient neoclassical design of the Herald's City of Saints near the Fortress Monastery being architecturally similar to the designs of the realm of Ultramar. With the Conclave then claiming their mutation of a high psyche potential as the product of the Acolytes' crusade and the blessings placed upon them by the Emperor, and the chapter's tactical and structural abnormalities as the result of innovation over millennia. Some have even proposed that they are directly descendant from the Emperor, which has become a popular belief amongst the Third Brotherhood, theorizing that they may be descendant from the Emperor directly, or a theorized chapter that somehow possessed the Emperor's gene seed. However, others argue that even if their gene seed is not from the Emperor, their genetic lineage ultimately traces back to him anyhow, and so the search for the Primarch is unnecessary, as they already know their ultimate origins in the Emperor. However, some Magisters of the Conclave have raised doubts to this lineage from the Ultramarines, though such sentiments have never been expressly conveyed by the Conclave, with the exception of when one unknown Magister, whose name has been struck from all records, in the 39th millennium. Gene Seed. The chapter's gene seed is particularly unstable, with an aspirant deficiency rate of 23%. This creates the necessity for a high recruitment rate for the chapter, as the majority of aspirants will either die of duress or have to be given the Emperor's mercy to prevent their corruption, whether in physical, mortal, or mental form. Some have argued the last-track process of induction and training for recruits is the product of this, though more derisive opponents of the Heralds argue the issue lies within their gene seed. No matter the cause, the result of this is the chapter is continually conducting recruitment missions amongst the underhives of Madrigal, where whole gangs are sometimes press-ganged into service if deemed suitable candidates. This program is then further supplemented by recruitment from Oban, where it is believed the aspirants are more physically potent, though this is not a proven fact. The Herald's high proportion of psyches then compound the need for higher recruitment rate, so as to compensate for the chapter's stringent psyche training program that has a disproportionately high number of casualties due to the execution of periculi found wanting in any physical, mental, or spiritual aspect. For this reason, both by need of much gene seed supplies and for fear of persecution for abnormality, the Heralds have been hesitant to hand over gene seed supplies. When pressed, the Heralds will nevertheless give up their required tithes. However, the presented tithes are always of a relatively remarkable purity, leading many to question the veracity of their tithe and encouraging the calls for an inquisitorial investigation. The only measure preventing this has been the chapter's thus far zealous dedication to the Imperial faith and their records of loyalty to the perceived interests of the Imperium, particularly the interests of the High Lords. Some, amongst the Mechanicum on Mars, have particularly noted how the gene seed bears a marked similarity to that of the Ultramarines and their successors, further calling doubt onto the Heralds' trustworthiness, as they bear little resemblance to the Orthodox Ultramarines, and the Heralds' atypical culture and high rate of mutation and abnormalities is not seen in the other Ultramarine descendants. Furthermore, the discovery of Imperial records on Terra that indicate Vandaia ordered for the Heralds' deviants to be overlooked, suggesting once upon a time their gene seed displayed notable abnormalities or an unconventional nature of some kind. On top of this, ancient administratum records suggest the chapter's gene seed bear resemblance to the lineage of Corvus Corax, though the lack of the Raven God's mutations of pale skin and their cultural differences also cast this lineage into doubt. With the similarity with Corvus Corax's lineage seemingly to appear soon after the end of the Age of Apostasy and during the Plague of Unbelief, and then disappearing around the 38th millennium. Officially, this is written off as a mistake amongst Imperial records, with some ancient chronicler mislabeling or confusing designations, though, to many, it further raises suspicions of the chapter's progenitors. Furthermore, the gene seed seems to have imbued the Heralds with psychic propensity, an uncommon trait amongst the lineage of Corax or Guilliman, further calling their lineage into question. Furthermore, some have commented on the fanatical streak presented within the chapter, arguing that the Heralds' almost radical devotion to their ideals is somehow a mental deficiency in their gene seed, though the broader consensus of the magisterium is that this is a result of the extensive indoctrination process of the Heralds of Volkaire. In the recent years, the Heralds have only been able to escape persecution due to their unique treaty of independence and by manipulating their cordial relationship with the Forge world Onega and their favour amongst the High Lords, much to the chagrin of their opponents amongst more traditional Astartes chapters. Though if the High Lords were to learn the true numbers of Heralds to turn traitorous, both in becoming renegades and heretics, they would surely take action against the chapter, making the need for the Heralds to conceal their historical records even greater, with these records being secretly sealed within the libraries of the Fortress Monastery that are not displayed or mentioned in any maps of the monastery. Origin. Little is known of the Heralds' origins in the modern Imperium. Most, if not all, records of the Heralds' past, prior to their voyage through the warp, have been lost. In their place, only myths amongst the chapter's brothers suggest a possible past. What is known for certain is that the Heralds entered the warp sometime in the M34 and emerged early in M36, when the Age of Apostasy had just begun and Vandaia had ascended to power. The Acolytes' Crusade is a prominent myth amongst the chapter that has been commonly accepted as the founding mythos of the chapter, detailing the trials and travels through the warp, into their emergence in M36. The legend dictates that the Heralds chapter went through troubling times after their supposed founding in M34, as they had abandoned the word of the Emperor and given into a more secular conviction of loyalty towards humanity itself and the High Lords, regardless of any spiritual understanding. This more secular perspective gradually began to give way to more occult spirituality, with some elements beginning to even worship the ruinous powers in secret. Among them was most prominently the chapter's upper echelons of marshals, chaplains, and even their ancient high marshal. This treachery began to infect their recruitment world, Carastes, as the populace became ever more corrupt. As the chapter's commanders allowed for such heresy to blossom, also beginning the codex-defiant number growth that would become a hallmark of the Heralds in the later times. Soon, the majority of the brothers, whom remained loyal, both secular and the few remaining Astartes with faith, began to understand that some corruption had taken hold of their chapter, with the upper echelons of the chapter holding vast banquets and sacrificing humans to the Emperor. From among their numbers emerged a leader, Volkaire, whom experienced a series of visions of Kerastes and Heralds being consumed by a tear in the warp, with demons rampaging through the planet's hive and consuming its populace. Volkaire understood this as a warning of what was to come should the chapter continue down its current path, and began to take action to eliminate the corruption seeping into the Herald's identity. Soon he began forming synods of traditionalists amongst the Herald's various companies, each beginning to coordinate an opposition against the malevolent intentions of the Herald's officer corps. These actions culminated in a coup led by Volkaire at a landsmeet in the chapter's fortress monastery, so that all the corrupted brothers could be eliminated at once. With synods crafting lists of known heretics and those of dubious morale standing to be killed. The coup began during the ceremonial banquet in the Great Hall as the traditionalists began slaughtering their corrupted brothers with their concealed weapons, with Volkaire cutting the throat of the corrupted High Marshal himself. By the end of an hour, despite resistance from some of the target brothers, almost the entire chapter had been purged of the corruption that had gripped it in the past decades, with only a few brothers being apprehended for a trial to discover whether they had betrayed the chapter's ideals and moral standards. From here, Volkaire began to investigate how far the corruption of the chapter had penetrated into Kerastes society through a series of raids into the lower and middle hives. What they found was that the lower hive levels had been consumed by demonic worship, while the upper levels had given into hedonistic abandon. Volkaire quickly decreed that the populace was beyond saving, and soon after began preparing for the chapter to depart the planet. Once in orbit, the chapter fleet, without warning, deployed exterminatus order weaponry onto the surface of the planet, with the cyclonic torpedo of the atmospheric incinerator torpedo being used to engulf the planet in a sea of fire, fulfilling the chapter's ancient mandate to eliminate corruption wherever it may lie, knowing that the only true way to eliminate heretical deviancy is to remove both root and stem, not simply to prune away its more salient branches. From here, the Heralds began upon a self-imposed penitence crusade into the maelstrom to purify themselves and repent for the failure to act against their corruption earlier. However, upon transiting into the warp, an enormous warp storm erupted and sent them adrift in the currents of the warp. The trauma of this killed most of the chapter's astropaths and crippled the rest. With this, the Heralds were lost blind in the warp and surrounded by hostile forces. Volkaire himself began to doubt whether his actions were the Emperor's will. After all, had his actions not brought about the immolation of Kerastes he had foreseen? Such doubt began to spread amongst the Astartes, whom began to circulate rumours that they had either been abandoned by the Emperor or decried the religious views that had led them to this disastrous expedition. Volkaire's disciples would, however, be vindicated in their faith by the seeming resurrection of Marshal Virelius, whom rose from his deathbed and proclaimed a new revelation of how the chapter would reclaim their honour and repent for their prior failings. Some decreed this seeming miracle as a machination of the warp entities and formed a party to kill Virelius's resurrected form. Others proclaimed that the battle barge's Gellerfields had not failed yet, and thus this action was only capable of the divine Emperor. Soon after, Virelius had moved into the barge's chapel for protection, with Volkaire believing that there violence would be refrained from due to spiritual reverence of the Emperor. Nevertheless, the party prepared and began moving towards the chapel, but before they could make their way to his quarters, they were met by an Astartes clad in silver armor, blocking their path. The brothers initially attacked the knight, believing him to be another aberration of the warp. However, after their null rods and ward-inscribed weapons made no effect on the knight, the party immediately recognized the figure of an ancient legend and bent their knees in reverence. They laid down their weapons and listened to Virelius's prophecy of the Emperor's revelation. Soon after, brothers all throughout the chapter experienced visions and messages from the Emperor, with Virelius helping to clarify their meaning, and codify a new series of doctrines the chapter would live by. The heralds rapidly experienced a rise in spirituality and belief in the emperor's divinity as a result, and soon the religious life became an important part of the heralds' cultural identity. Among these doctrines, the chapter would pledge to uphold their own and the broader imperial population's belief in the emperor's divinity and the right to use any tool available to them to fulfill their duty. Furthermore, there was a need for spiritual duties to be carried out. With the chapter's traditions of being bound to establish idols or prophets, the primarchs and the emperor, and to carry out sermons alongside normal humans wherever they went and conducted conflict. The coming of a prophet was also predicted in the future whom would lead the heralds and the Imperium to realize the emperor's vision and eliminate chaos from the material realm, purge the Immaterium of chaotic taint, and lead humanity towards an enlightened existence. Furthermore, the visions outlined the need to carry out 13 trials to prove themselves worthy of the task assigned to them by the Emperor and purge them of their doubt in combat against those enemies whom would show them where the path of heresy leads. In this, they were tasked with raiding a demon world of Slaanesh to prove they could resist the temptations of the flesh and mind, defeat a heretical warband of Nurgle to prove they could overcome the resilient opponents of the warp, best the demon of Khorne and his warband in combat, and retrieve an ancient halberd belonging to the herald's ancestors, which had been lost in the crystal labyrinth of Tzeentch's domain. To aid in these tasks, the Emperor imbued Volkaire with an element of his divine aspect, making his essence both that of the Immaterium and Materium. Furthermore, the Silver Astartes and Virelius would accompany them to assist in their duties and ensure they did not stray from the path. The trials began as they emerged from warp transit into real space within the Maelstrom, several thousand light-years away from the Imperial space. The heralds assigned navigators had all died by their emergence, and so were incapable of making guided warp jumps, and could only make calculated jumps across 4 light-years. It took nearly a century and a half, but the brothers eventually trailed their way out of the Maelstrom after having conquered their trials, taking their trophies of the Corrupted Heart and a greater Slaaneshi Demonette, a book of plagues belonging to the Nurglite Warmaster Merrick Vaughn, the Claymore of Skane, a Bloodthirster of Khorne, and the staff of the Lord of Change, Scaruthraxon. The ability to carry out these actions following the chapter's civil strife and losses in the warp have led many to question the veracity of the myth, citing such feats as nearly impossible. Nevertheless, the legend maintains that after achieving these feats, the chapter finally arrived in Imperial space, in the Cordelia sector. However, Volkaire, Virelius, and the Silver Astartes could no longer be found amongst their numbers. Common belief holds that they had finally ascended to the Emperor's side for their long years of service and piety. The Heralds have emerged into M36 soon after Vandia's ascendancy to control of both the Administratum and Ecclesiarchy. In Vandia, they saw the foretold prophet of Virelius' revelation, subsequently pledging their loyalty to the tyrant and accepting the mandate to help monitor the Cordelia sector. Beliefs. The Heralds believe that the Emperor was a divine being and have fully adopted the worship of him as a religious figure. However, the Heralds are distinguished by their unique beliefs and religious practices that place them firmly as unorthodox in opposition to the Ecclesiarchy. In opposition to the broader orthodox tenets of the Ecclesiarchy, the Heralds do not accept the worship of saints, but rather sees a select few as prophets sent to lead the populace back into the Emperor's light, such as Sebastian Thor. Others, like Celestine, are seen as heralds, imbued with the Emperor's blessing, but not of any theologically divine significance, and by no means warranting reverence. This unorthodox theology and doctrine has further arisen from the teachings of Veleth, whom campaigned against the iconoclasm and veneration practices of the Ecclesiarchy. Veleth particularly argued the veneration of saints diverts worship from the Emperor and while in theory this veneration does not undermine the emperor's divinity, Veleth realized that in practice this led to the deification of mortal humans alongside the emperor, amongst the broader populace, who was not educated of the nuances of theology. Furthermore, iconoclasm is rejected for similar criticism as distracting worship from the emperor and directing it towards icons rather than the actual emperor. This doctrine of belief has been promoted throughout the Cordelia sector since the eruption of the Cicatrix Maledictum, as their control over the regional ecclesiarchy has tightened and led to their own theology being pushed onto the broader populace. The permeation of their beliefs has been achieved to a greater degree over the course of the past century. Nevertheless, more traditional views are still held by many aspects of the populace, particularly amongst the lower hives and the more rural or less developed worlds of the Cordelia sector, where the Heralds' influence is not as great. The Heralds do, however, revere Volkaire as a semi-divine figure, almost exclusively amongst all others, citing that Volkaire was imbued with a divine aspect of the Emperor, making him composed of two equal parts, mortal Astartes and the divine soul of the Emperor. As such, Volkaire is usually revered as the epitome of an Astartes, and therefore humanity, and is perceived as the embodiment of the Emperor's vision for humanity. The Heralds also worship some chapter prophets whom were believed to lead the Heralds back onto the path of the Emperor when they had deviated, such as Veleth, the fifth prophet, whom returned the chapter to many of its historically persecuted traditions. It should also be noted that though the Heralds have opposed the ecclesiarchy's practices and beliefs, they are equally as oppressively dogmatic, if not more so, towards the Cordelian sect of the ecclesiarchy, whom they unofficially dictate theology to, and through them to the broader populace. The Heralds, despite their dogmatic tendency, encourage the pursuit of academic, artistic and theological trainings, all with a heavily religious focus though, as the conclave believes this pursuit of refinement in these fields help to achieve a more refined humanity amongst the Heralds of Astartes. As the Heralds believe, the Astartes should also operate as the exemplar to unaugmented humans in cultural and intellectual expression, not only in martial aspects, as Emperor's vision for humanity was not simply achieve a human-dominated galaxy, but to achieve an enlightened humanity. These pursuits then also serve to keep the brothers occupied and keep their minds from straying from the path of the righteous, while also allowing for the Heralds to prevent the moral corruption of the populace of their local sector of space. As their theology and artistic works have become prominent amongst the populace of both their recruitment worlds and the planets with their sphere of influence, though much of these works only appeal to the artistic elite, while only being forced upon the masses through propaganda with mixed success. On the use of psychic powers, the Heralds believe that the Immaterium itself, and the powers it provides, are not inherently corrupt, with the conclave pointing to the Emperor's use of such powers as a proof of this, believing the warp to be neither inherently good nor evil. Instead, they believe that the forces of chaos and the power of the chaos gods possess and or provide are a corruption of the Immaterium. In this, they distinguish between the Immaterium, the natural state of non-material realm, and the warp, the chaotically corrupted version of the Immaterium. As such, they acknowledge the danger of warp corruption, but believe that its use is an almost semi-divine act, mirroring their reverence of the Emperor in seeing these powers as a tool provided for the betterment of humanity. Controversially, some chapter scholars even theorize that to achieve a psychic humanity was a part of the Emperor's final plan. However, many dispute this, and there is little evidence to support it, and the notion remains a fringe ideology only discussed amongst elite magisters. The Heralds also believe that their propensity towards being psyker is a burden directly conveyed onto them by the Emperor himself. In this, they also believe that psykers are the Emperor's most favored sons, and they have been deemed worthy enough to shoulder the burden of being a psyker. Nevertheless, this propensity itself is seen to be both a blessing and a curse. With the abilities endowed, giving one greater abilities to serve the Imperium, but also making one substantially more likely to be corrupted by chaos or be killed by their brothers if they fail to meet the standards expected of periculi. Psykers, called periculi, are viewed as useful by the chapter's leaders, but simultaneously dangerous. In this, the chapter's propensity is exploited to the full to produce high numbers of skilled and specialized psykers, while also keeping most inexperienced and unproven psykers, usually acolytes, in a drug-induced comatose state when not in battle. Only psykers whom have proved themselves to be undoubtedly loyal are allowed to be awake at all times. However, unlike other heralds, whom are only encouraged, periculi must dedicate their free time to study or skill the academic arts, so that their minds do not stray toward deviancy. Most non-psyker heralds view periculi with a mixture of awe and pity, as their abilities and status are praised within the chapter, but accept that the psykers must be held in their subdued state to ensure the safety and purity of the chapter. Chapter records place these practices emergence as at some point during the chapter's time in the warp, with Sentinel scholars theorizing it as a method of control developed as a precaution against the dangers of the warp. Cultures. The Heralds have multiple unique cultures within the chapter itself, as its organization into 3 brotherhoods, which operate as de facto independent forces, has led to each developing its own unique practices and cultural life. First Brotherhood. The first has been noted to be the most orthodox of the 3 brotherhoods, as its stationary garrisoning in the Cordelia sector on Madrigal makes it subject to much observation by the numerous organs in the Imperial bureaucracy. As such, the first may only practice its most unorthodox tendencies in the privacy of the first district of the Fortress Monastery, where none may look upon them and realize the deviant tendencies of the Heralds chapter. However, occasionally they show their true colors in public demonstrations, as they often flay prisoners alive when they have transgressed against the Herald's beliefs or practices, with this fate often being reserved for corrupt priests of the Cordelia sect of the ecclesiarchy, or just deacons whom preach for a return to the traditional practices of the broader ecclesiarchy on Terra and Ophelia IV, or for pilgrims whom have cheated on the mountain path to their fortress monastery as a part of their attempt to join the chapter's ranks of aspirants. Despite their relative orthodoxy, the first remain reclusive in regard to other Astartes chapters, and have only emerged to commonly participate in operations alongside others after the declaration of the Tertium, when the Heralds declared themselves first among equals, in regard to other smaller chapters located in the Cordelia sector. The first also has a more reserved outlook towards the use of auxiliary guardsmen forces, as they have much disdain for the weak-willed populace of the Imperium and will only employ elite guardsmen or the forces of the Scions as auxiliaries. Third Brotherhood. The third has been noted to be the most zealous of all the brotherhoods and are fanatical worshippers of the Herald's brand of the Imperial Creed. They operate as a de facto crusading brotherhood and specialize in operations against heretical and demonic forces. Moreover, they are also the most radically unorthodox of the brotherhoods, openly employing unorthodox use of psychic powers and tactics to defeat their enemies, going so far as to bind demons and use demonic weapons upon occasion, believing their faith will shield them from corruption, though this has led to the corruption of many a brother, but has been highly effective in fighting demons in the short term. This unorthodox and radical temperament has also led to the third to be the most reclusive of the brotherhoods, often entering a war zone to only contact other Imperial forces with emissaries and then operating in isolation from other forces beside the auxiliaries they bring with them, then departing from a war zone immediately after victory has been achieved. However, in contrast to the first, they are the Brotherhood who most readily and extensively employs the use of auxiliaries, with their forces both being composed of professional guardsmen, elite science, and the hordes of militia they recruit along their crusades as meat shields for their more adept auxiliary forces. Fourth Brotherhood. The Fourth retain many unorthodox practices and beliefs common to the Heralds, but have also learned to temper their attitudes in the presence of others. This has led to the Fourth to be far more diplomatic than their fellow Brotherhoods. In this, they will only practice their unorthodoxy in private and will explicitly restrain from such actions when in the company of other Astartes who might be disturbed by such tendencies. This has made the Fourth the most outwardly friendly of the Brotherhoods, with them commonly operating alongside other Astartes in theatres of war, with this being necessary as part of their expertise in fighting Xenos, often cooperating as part of crusades against Xenos threats around the Imperium of Man. Then, also sharing a similar outlook towards auxiliaries as the Third, accepting a broad spectrum of auxiliary forces to aid in their crusades against the abominable alien forces of the Void. And now, to carry these books back.